So this is a coming together, a collaboration between not only the Beyond the Bars conference, but also the Teachers College, Columbia University Health Equity and Social Justice Conference. So in coming together and doing this joint introduction, it's my role to read the remarks that will give you some idea of how Michelle Alexander has arrived at this point in time. Michelle Alexander is a highly acclaimed civil rights lawyer, advocate, and legal scholar who currently holds a joint appointment at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity and the Moritz College of Law at The Ohio State University. Prior to joining the Kirwan Institute, Alexander was an associate professor of law at Stanford Law School, where she directed the civil rights clinics. In 2005, she won a Soros Justice Fellowship, which supported the writing of her first book, The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. The book has received rave reviews and has been featured in many national radio and television media outlets. For several years, Alexander served as the director of the Racial Justice Project for the ACLU of Northern California, where she helped to lead a national campaign against racial profiling by law enforcement. While an associate at Saperstein, Goldstein, Demchak, and Baller, she specialized in plaintiff side cases, plaintiff side class action lawsuits alleging race and gender discrimination. Alexander is a graduate of Stanford Law School and Vanderbilt University. Please join me in welcoming Michelle Alexander.
Hello, New York. I'm so happy to be here. Hello. Thank you. Thank you for the incredibly warm welcome and the very kind introductions. I am just thrilled to be here, surrounded by so many folks who are dedicated to transformative justice. This gathering is happening at such a critical moment in our nation's history. It's a time when it seems that many people all over the country, in small towns, big cities, from coast to coast, are beginning to wake up to the reality of race and justice in America. I think a time comes when the truth stares you in the face, daring you to look away and say nothing. But deep in your soul, you know that a breaking point has been reached, and that if you avert your gaze or change the subject, you will betray not only yourself, your children, or your community, but all those who risked their lives so that Black children would not have to be told that in the eyes of the law, their lives don't matter. That moment was reached when Michael Brown was gunned down and the young people of Ferguson stood up. It was not the brazen killing of a young unarmed Black man by the police that forced an end to the silence. To the contrary, what happened that day was nothing new. Isabel Wilkerson, the author of The Warmth of Other Suns, acknowledged this in an essay published in The Guardian, pointing out that the rate of police killings of Black Americans today is nearly the same as the rate of lynchings in the Jim Crow era. What happened that summer day when Officer Wilson killed Michael Brown was nothing new. But the young people in Ferguson had had enough. They were not going to allow the police to leave Michael Brown's body lying in the street for 4 hours while the authorities scrambled to get their story straight. These bold and courageous young folks took to the streets, and in the weeks and the months that followed that they stayed in the streets, They scrawled on handmade signs 3 words eerily reminiscent of eras we supposedly left behind: Black Lives Matter. Now, I'm well aware that this particular crisis may feel new to many in this country, but its roots are as old as the country itself. We continue to live the paradox of a nation founded with the bold preamble that all men are created equal with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, while at the same time denying all of those basic civil and human rights to slaves, and writing into our original Constitution the rule that black people counted as only 3/5 of a human being. This paradox of a nation born with lofty ideals of equality and freedom, but extending those ideals primarily to wealthy white men, is the founding paradox of this nation, and it remains a paradox to this day, even now as a black president sits in the Oval Office. Yes. We have inherited the glorious promise and the ugly paradox, and yet we too often close our eyes and refuse to acknowledge the painful implications. As I was thinking about what I was going to say tonight and getting my notes together, I kept getting messages from folks who were heading to Selma this weekend. Racial justice advocates, civil rights advocates from all over the country are heading to Selma, and I heard the President of the United States himself plans to make an appearance to commemorate the historic civil rights struggles and victories there. Now, at times like these, at these moments of commemoration, it's tempting to be romantic about the past struggles and overly rosy in our assessment of the present. But such revisionism does not serve the dream that Dr. King and Ella Baker and so many others risked their lives for. Now, none of this is to deny the extraordinary gains that have been made in some spheres. I mean, I would deny and dishonor the sacrifices of people like Ella Baker and many, many others if I didn't acknowledge that my own life has been drastically, greatly improved because of their courage, their sacrifice, their advocacy. But if we're going to ask ourselves honestly as we commemorate Selma, how far have we come and where must we go from here? What is truly necessary as we work for justice in this new time, this new age, then I think we must first pause and ask ourselves, how do we measure progress? We could measure it in all kinds of ways. The number of people who are CEOs or leading Fortune 500 companies, the number of black or brown politicians or presidents, or the number of people with 2-car garages and SUVs. We could measure our progress in purely materialistic terms. Do we have as much stuff as we think we should? Stuff like money, cars, degrees, titles. Measuring progress in this way seems to make sense in a capitalist society where the goal is to compete to get more stuff. There are winners and losers, and everyone says they want to get ahead. Very rarely do we ask, get ahead of whom? And what will happen to them, those who are left behind? Well, I want to suggest that there is another way to measure progress, one that seems to have been forgotten in the years since Dr. King and Malcolm X were laid to rest. It's not a new measure by any means. To the contrary, it is very, very old. For centuries, it has been said by numerous philosophers and theologians that any society, any civilization, must be judged by how it treats its most vulnerable members and its prisoners. Yes. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would surely agree with that assessment. Jesus himself said, "What you do unto the least of these, my brethren, you do unto me." And so when I stand here tonight and consider how we in America fare when judged by this measure, how we treat our most vulnerable members and our prisoners, I cannot help but think of the millions of poor people, overwhelmingly poor folks of color, who are cycling in and out of our criminal justice system today in this era of mass incarceration In this post-King, post-civil rights era, a time when our prison population has more than quintupled and millions of people are now permanently locked up or locked out, stripped of the very civil and human rights that Dr. King and so many others risked their lives for and some even died for. It is a time when a black man, a father, can be choked to death by the police, begging for his life on video for the crime of selling untaxed cigarettes, and a grand jury comprised of men and women, fellow American citizens, could say no crime had occurred at all. Snuffing out the life of a black man over so petty an offense is no crime at all. It is a time when our collective answer to the violence that persists on the streets of Chicago, New Orleans, Detroit, and beyond has been more violence. That's been our answer. For we must never forget that imprisonment itself is a form of violence. It is legalized, state-sponsored violence. But it is violence, nonetheless, to take a person out of his home or off the street at gunpoint, even if you have a badge, and force them into a cage. And it is difficult to imagine that Dr. King would have believed that in communities ravaged by poverty, hopelessness, and despair, that the answer would simply be more violence, that we could punish and threaten our way to peaceful communities, to a place of justice. Today, a prison industrial complex, a prison system run for profit, a system of mass incarceration has been born. It is a system unprecedented in world history. And it is one that is so violent, so brutal, so unrelenting in its punitiveness that many Americans can scarcely believe the truth about this system when confronted with the facts. And for poor people and people of color, this system extends far beyond the prison walls into the streets of Ferguson and New York City and Chicago and to rural Louisiana and beyond. Once the system targets you, sets its sights on you, it's nearly impossible to escape its grip, its constant surveillance and control. The whites-only signs have come down, but new signs have gone up. Notices placed in job applications, rental agreements, loan applications, welfare forms, school applications, and petitions for licenses. New signs have gone up, informing the public that the millions of people branded felons and criminals in this era of mass incarceration, are not wanted here. Discrimination is now perfectly legal against them. The lynch mobs may be long gone, but the threat of police violence is ever present. A wrong move or sudden gesture could mean massive retaliation by the police. A wallet can be mistaken for a gun. It is a system that has arisen out of the ashes of slavery and Jim Crow, a system that has branded tens of millions of people in this country as felons, shamed and scorned, relegated to a permanent second-class status. It is a system that rests on the premise that some lives simply don't matter. So if we're serious, and we're going to ask the question, how much progress has our nation made in achieving the dream that inspired the Civil Rights Act, the dream that fed the courage of those who marched in Selma, then I think we've got to ask ourselves whether we continue to create and maintain systems and structures that guarantee the exclusion, suffering, and oppression of others. If we're going to measure progress, we need to look not up to the top of the pyramid, to Barack Obama for evidence of progress, but down and ask ourselves, how do we as a society treat the most vulnerable as well as our prisoners? Not how the relative few, the rich or famous, are doing. And when we ask ourselves that question, an uncomfortable reality begins to emerge. We must confront an inconvenient truth, the truth that we in America have done it again. We have rebirthed a caste-like system in this country, a new Jim Crow. Now, I must confess that I'm very tempted right now to give you all a new Jim Crow lecture. An overview of the war on drugs and the war on crime and how it all actually works as opposed to how it's advertised, and how these wars, and more importantly, the war mentality, us versus them, search and destroy, lock them up and throw away the key, has decimated communities of color, and how our legal system has conspired to keep millions of people cycling in and out of prison for the rest of their lives. For I know that many people in this audience may think they know how the system works, just like I once did, but really don't. Some of you may think you have some idea of how bad it is, how discriminatory, how brutal, how the system is rigged, but you don't really know the half of it, just like I once thought I knew but didn't. So if you don't really know the role the drug war has played in quintupling our nation's prison system, if you don't know that whites are just as likely to use and sell drugs as people of color, if you don't know all about the financial incentives that have been given to state and local law enforcement, millions of dollars paid rewarding law enforcement agencies for the sheer numbers of drug arrests, and if you're confused and think that maybe the various wars that have been declared on poor communities of color, the war on crime and the war on drugs, have been focused on rooting out violent offenders or drug kingpins, and if you don't know that the overwhelming majority of people arrested and swept into the system have been arrested for relatively minor crimes, and if you don't get that this system operates practically from cradle to grave, targeting young people at very young ages, often before they're old enough to vote, stopping, frisking, searching them, when all they may be doing is heading home with some Skittles in their pocket, well then please read my book. Yeah. And if you don't know that the current system of mass incarceration can be traced back to segregationists who once chanted segregation forever and then changed their tune with the passage of the Civil Rights Acts and began chanting law and order and built a Get Tough movement, a movement designed by pollsters and political strategists who found that thinly veiled promises to get tough on them, a group not so subtly defined by race, could be enormously successful in appealing to poor and working class whites. If you don't know about the Southern strategy, if you don't know about racial code language and the use of welfare and crime as a means to break the Democratic Party in the South and build a new Republican majority, and if you don't know about how this backlash emerged at precisely the same moment that work was vanishing, disappearing from inner city communities due to deindustrialization and globalization, leading to waves of joblessness and the economic collapse of inner city communities and rising crime, creating the perfect storm, or if you're operating under some delusion that the Democrats have been the better angels, that they have been kinder or gentler in this era of mass incarceration, if you don't know that it was President Bill Clinton who mastered the game of using subtle racial appeals, and that it was his administration, a Democratic administration, that escalated the drug war far beyond what his Republican predecessors even dreamed possible, if you don't know how the U.S. Supreme Court eviscerated Fourth Amendment rights and immunize the system from judicial scrutiny for racial bias, if you don't know this history, if you have some trouble connecting the dots between slavery, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration, then please educate yourself. I wrote my book in the hopes that it would be a tool, but there are many, many other good tools, excellent books and resources. Read Angela Davis's book, Are Prisons Obsolete? Read Douglas Blackman's book, Slavery by Another Name. Read Paul Butler's book, Let's Get Free. Read Christian Parenti's book, Lockdown America. Read Prison Profiteers, Who Makes Money Off of Mass Incarceration. Read Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy. And if you're an academic, you'll especially appreciate the data and analysis in Bruce Western's book, Punishment and Inequality. Outstanding book. Read Marie Gottschalk's book, Caught, the Prison State and the Lockdown of American Politics. I mean, I could spend all night describing the problem and telling you what to read, to learn about it, and the many different valid and competing perspectives that have been offered. But in the short time I have here tonight, I don't want to spend all my time describing the problem and telling you what to do to learn all about it. I want to take this time to challenge us, to wrestle with the question of what is required of us as people who are dedicated to racial and social justice at this moment in our history, 50 years after Selma. What now in our struggle for justice, in this era of mass incarceration? And I must say that in reflecting on this question, I find that I have little patience now for the politics and business as usual. I no longer believe that this system will die a death of 1,000 little cuts, a little reform here, a little reform there. I no longer believe it. For what we've seen is that systems of racial and social control adapt too easily to minor reforms, and in fact have the capacity to be reborn in new form, tailored to the needs and constraints of the time. What we face today is not a problem of failed public policy, for the system actually works very well, precisely as it has been designed. Now, what we face is a crisis of conscience. And those who argue that advocacy challenging mass incarceration can be successful without overturning the utterly immoral public consensus that gave rise to it and sustains it are engaging in fanciful thinking, a form of denial. Yes, isolated victories can be won, even a string of victories, but in the absence of a fundamental shift in public consciousness, this system as a whole will remain intact. To the extent victories are won without a shift, the system will rebound. It will adapt. It will emerge in new form, just as convict leasing replaced slavery, or it will be reborn, just as mass incarceration replaced Jim Crow. Now, we do not have to look any further for evidence of the adaptability of this system in the history of New York City. Marijuana was decriminalized in this great city in the 1970s. The city was way ahead of its time. Possession of a small quantity of marijuana became a civil offense like a speeding ticket. But there was a loophole. There's always a loophole. If marijuana is in public view, well, then it's still a crime, a misdemeanor warranting arrest. And the police found in New York City that even after marijuana was decriminalized, not only could they continue to arrest poor black and brown folks, but they could ratchet up the rate of arrests by many, many fold. Between the years 2002 and 2012, the NYPD spent 1 million hours making 440,000 marijuana possession arrests, overwhelmingly of young black and brown men. How? By telling them, empty your pockets, what you got on you. The practice continues to this day, as the editorial board of the New York Times recently reported, quote, Mr. de Blasio's team has produced contrived numbers in an unpersuasive attempt to prove that the arrest picture is somewhat improved. But there's no hiding the fact that New York City is still administering unfair police practices that disproportionately penalize communities of color and damage the lives of overwhelmingly young people who are targeted. Public anger around this issue will continue to grow until Mr. de Blasio changes the very ugly status quo, end quote. The striking racial disparity can be seen by the contrasting Upper East Side, which has one of the lowest marijuana arrest rates in the city, with its neighbor directly to the northeast Harlem. The arrest rate for marijuana possession in East Harlem is 110 times higher than the Upper East Side. Even though we all know, and studies have confirmed for decades, that people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites. Over and over we've seen that the same mentality and belief systems resurface and continue to operate, exploiting whatever loopholes are available or manifesting themselves in new structural arrangements. So what does this mean for us as we reflect on doing the work of transformative justice? Well, after years of walking the path of piecemeal policy reform and tinkering with the machine, working as a civil rights lawyer and advocate, I now finally understand exactly what Dr. King meant when he said just months before his death, after Selma, after the Civil Rights Acts and voting rights had been passed, he told a reporter, quote, "For years I labored with the idea of reforming the existing institutions of the society, a little change here, a little change there. Now I feel quite differently. I think you've got to have a reconstruction of the entire society, a revolution of values," end quote. Yes. Frustrated by white resistance to addressing in any meaningful way decaying ghettos, failing schools, structural joblessness, and crippling poverty, Dr. King said that America must be reborn. He said, quote, The dispossessed of this nation, the poor, both white and Negro, live in a cruelly unjust society. They must organize a revolution against that injustice, not against the lives of their fellow citizens, but against the structures through which society is refusing to lift the load of poverty, end quote. And when speaking to a staff at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1967, staff who were concerned that the civil rights movement had lost its steam and direction, King said the time had come to shift from a civil rights movement to a human rights movement. Political reform efforts were no longer adequate to the task at hand, he said, quote, "For the past 12 years, we have been in a reform movement. But after Selma and the Voting Rights Bill, we moved into a new era, which must be an era of revolution. We must see the great distinction between a reform movement and a revolutionary movement. We are called upon to raise basic questions about the whole society," end quote. Well, today I fear that many civil rights lawyers and advocates like myself have been stuck in a model of advocacy that King was determined to leave behind. Rather than challenging the basic structure of society and doing the hard work of movement building on behalf of poor people of all colors, we have been tempted too often by the opportunity of people of color to be included in the political and economic structure as is. And we have allowed ourselves to be willfully blind to the emergence of a new caste system, a system of social excommunication that has denied millions of poor people and people of color basic human dignity. The significance of this cannot be overstated, for the failure to acknowledge the humanity and dignity of all persons has lurked at the root of every caste system. This common thread explains why in the 1780s, the British Society for the Abolition of Slavery adopted as its official seal a woodcut of a kneeling slave above a banner that read, "Am I not a man and a brother?" That symbol was followed more than 100 years later by signs worn around the necks of black sanitation workers during the Poor People's Campaign, answering the slave's question with the simple statement, "I am a man." And yet here we are, decades later, and a black man in the White House, and most Americans claiming to be colorblind, and thousands of people are holding signs reminding a forgetful nation that Black lives matter. The fact that sign is necessary today in protest of yet another caste system suggests that the model of advocacy that has been employed for the past several decades is not, as King predicted, adequate to the task at hand. If we can agree that what is needed now at this critical juncture is not mere tinkering or tokenism, but as King himself insisted more than 40 years ago, a radical restructuring of our society, then perhaps we can also agree that a radical restructuring of our approach to advocacy is in order as well. Of course, there are those who tell me that my newfound revolutionary spirit is misplaced, especially now that there is so much progress being made through traditional political channels to end mass incarceration in America. I'm often asked, aren't I thrilled by marijuana legalization? Aren't I delighted that the Koch brothers and Newt Gingrich are sitting down at the same table with the ACLU in the center of American progress to come up with a grand plan to end mass incarceration? Aren't I glad that President Obama granted clemency to 8 people convicted of nonviolent drug offenses? Isn't it great that the Justice Department just issued a report finding a pattern of practice of race discrimination in the Ferguson Police Department? Aren't I delighted that the new mayor of New York City finally settled the stop and frisk case? Over and over I'm asked, did you ever think back when you were first writing your book that any of this would be possible? And I have to confess that yes. Yes, I definitely thought this was possible. In many ways, it is exactly what I feared. As a nation, we are on the verge of doing many of the right things for the wrong reasons. Now, don't get me wrong. I am a supporter of marijuana legalization. In fact, I believe that the possession of all drugs for personal use should be decriminalized. I believe, yes. I believe we should follow the example set by Portugal, which more than a decade ago decriminalized the simple possession of all drugs and saw rates of drug addiction and drug abuse fall as that nation stopped caging people caught with drugs and started investing in drug treatment on demand. Yes. And I am glad that there is emerging bipartisan support for reducing mandatory minimum sentences for some nonviolent crimes, and I'm happy about reforms that will make it more likely that people struggling with mental illness will have a chance of getting meaningful treatment rather than a jail cell. Yes. But when considering whether marijuana legalization and the recent bipartisan initiatives represent genuine progress, and by that I mean truly transformational change, I think we should ask ourselves, have we as a nation changed our minds about the dignity and value of the people whose lives have been destroyed by the drug war? Or have we simply changed our minds about marijuana? If legalization is motivated primarily by our changing views about the drug, the growing consensus in the medical community that marijuana is actually less harmful than alcohol or tobacco, but our views about them, those who've been targeted for these drug crimes, hasn't really changed, then we haven't made much progress at all from a racial justice perspective. Similarly, if we've got to ask ourselves, is the primary engine driving the new bipartisan enthusiasm for criminal justice reform driven primarily by a new awakening to the value of the lives and communities that have been destroyed? Or is this new enthusiasm for reform driven primarily by concerns about the costs of this massive prison state and reluctance to raise taxes on the predominantly white middle class? Truly transformative change will come when and only when we change rules, laws, policies, and practices because we have opened our hearts and changed our minds for the better regarding the dignity and value of all people of all colors, no matter who they are, where they came from, or what they may have done. By doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, we save lives today only to lose them tomorrow. For what we know, what we certainly ought to know by now, is that these systems of racial and social control adapt and morph over time, adapting to the needs and constraints of the time. Ultimately, what lies at the core of the current caste-like system is a flawed public consensus, a failure to care, really care across lines of race and class, the belief that some lives simply don't matter. And it is this failure to care that lies at the core of every caste system that has ever existed in the United States or anywhere else in the world. So I rejoice for the lives that may be spared by these new bipartisan alliances, but I am filled with grief for those we will certainly lose tomorrow if we do not find a way to steer this ship in a radically different direction and develop a new moral consensus. Yes. And yes, I am glad that Mayor de Blasio stopped fighting the litigation brought by the Center for Constitutional Rights, challenging the city's discriminatory abusive stop and frisk practices, and that he responded to the overwhelming pressure brought to bear by grassroots organizing going on right here in New York City. Yes, we made him. But I have to pause and take a deep breath as I consider how far he and we have truly come. For even as de Blasio has rightly entered into a landmark consent decree and spoken the truth about his sons dealing with the police, he has practically in the same breath clung to and reaffirmed the cruel and immoral doctrine known as broken windows policing. Yes. And for those who may be unfamiliar, broken windows policing is the notion that the best way to make our communities safe and secure is to come down with a hammer on people who commit the most minor of infractions. Not on all people, of course, for broken windows policing is not practiced with any great enthusiasm in wealthy neighborhoods, but only on the poorest and most vulnerable communities of color. This notion that to deal effectively with them, those people, the others, we must arrest and fine and cite people en masse for things like selling untaxed cigarettes, riding a bicycle on the sidewalk, jaywalking, or playing your music too loud. this zero-tolerance, purely punitive mentality and impulse, believing this is how you make a community safe. This is how you keep them under control. This belief system lies at the root of all that is wrong with so much of our politics and our justice system today. Perhaps you've heard the old saying, when all you've got is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And when it comes to poor communities, particularly communities of color, all we bring is the hammer. Everyone in those communities is viewed and treated as nails, nails to be pounded down into submission, beat down, so you can barely see their heads anymore. The statistics cited in the DOJ's report on Ferguson, but the grossly disproportionate rates of black folks, folks of color being cited for minor infractions in Ferguson, you can find those same statistics right here in New York City. You need to look no further than New York City. Now, I will not deny that broken windows are a sign of distress in a community if they become a regular occurrence, just like trash in the streets or lots of hostile graffiti on the walls. When plentiful, those are signs. And I'll be the first to admit that ignoring those signs of distress comes at a price that is paid first and foremost by the people who live there. The critical question is, how do we respond to those signs? Do we bring the hammer? Do we not have other tools at our disposal? And if we do, and I know we do, what sort of crime do we commit by failing to use them? And please do not believe it when people say, oh, these are only misdemeanor offenses, so no big deal, no need to be too concerned about what's going on there. For after all, it was just a minor misdemeanor offense that Eric Garner was accused of when a police officer saw fit to choke him to death for his crime. Now, of course, that's an extreme case, but the point remains. If you know anything at all about how this system works, you know that if you're poor, you likely can't pay that misdemeanor fine. And you might lose your job because of all the time you have to take off standing around waiting in court. And these misdemeanor offenses, they too can follow you for life in this age of technology. And they too can be the reason you're denied employment or housing. And suddenly this little misdemeanor offense is the reason you're unemployed or homeless, and now this little misdemeanor is being used against you in a sentencing hearing because you robbed a convenience store or sold some weed because you were hungry or desperate for cash. And then the judge looks at you and says the words, repeat offender. And the prosecutor says, yeah, he's nothing but a troublemaker. He's had numerous run-ins with the law. So yes, it matters. It really matters when we show up in the lives of poor people with nothing but a hammer. Like I said, I believe that we now find ourselves at a fork in the road. We can continue down the road most traveled, the road of business and politics as usual, the path of reforming our political institutions, a little reform here, a little reform there, the path that Dr. King was determined to leave behind. Or we can choose a different path, the rocky, dangerous path that comes without a map. If we choose this path, there will be no guidebook, no instructions. All we will have is our moral compass and the whisperings of our ancestors in our ears, reminding us to dig for deeper truth and to speak and to act with greater courage. The courage to prove that we are truly in solidarity with the least of these, those who have been despised, those who have been labeled, those who have been cast out, locked up, locked out. Proving that solidarity means being willing to speak unpopular, difficult truths, never avoiding the racial dimensions or the profound moral questions for purposes of expediency. It means never seeking justice on the cheap, but always demanding full restoration and reparations for those who have been harmed the most. It means being on fire for justice and believing with undying faith that the slaves who sung songs of freedom in the cotton fields and the immigrants who are toiling in the fields today and those who risked their lives on freedom rides or who marched in Selma and those who faced tear gas in Ferguson and all those who march carrying signs saying Black Lives Matter and I can't breathe right here on the streets of New York City, we're not foolish to dream that America can be born again. We can and we must build a movement to end not only mass incarceration and mass deportation, but a broad-based, radical human rights movement that ends once and for all our nation's history and cycle of creating caste-like systems in America. A movement for education, not incarceration, jobs, not jails, a movement to end all legal forms of discrimination against people released from prison, discrimination that denies them basic human rights to work, shelter, to food. A movement for voting rights for all, including those behind bars. Including those behind bars. A movement that will end the drug war once and for all and shift to a public health model for dealing with drug abuse and drug addiction. A movement that will stand up to the police unions and transform the police itself from warriors into peace officers directly accountable to the communities they serve. A movement that will ensure that every dollar saved from ending the wars that have been declared on poor communities, the wars on crime and the wars on drugs, will be invested back into the communities that have been harmed most. Justice reinvestment and reparations. A movement that abandons our purely punitive approach to dealing with violence and violent crime and embraces a more restorative and rehabilitative approach, one that takes seriously the interests of the victim, the offender, and the community as a whole. A movement that is rooted in the awareness of the dignity and humanity of all of us, no matter who we are, where we came from, or what we may have done. I hope and pray that this year, 2015, will be the year that King's revolution was finally born, the nonviolent revolution he prayed for and died for. Finally, the sleeping giant woke up, got up, and walked, and chose the road less traveled. And that, I believe historians one day will say, ultimately made all the difference. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. Thank you.
You gotta take in the standing ovation. You can move over just a little bit.
Thank you.
Here, let's put this down since we're gonna take a picture. As you can see, there's absolutely no way that we could be exposed to this without giving her an award. So please remain for just 50 seconds. The 7th Annual Health Disparities Conference at Teachers College Columbia University, the Health Equity and Social Justice Conference, honors Michelle Alexander. Nationally renowned legal scholar and author of the acclaimed best-selling book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, for outstanding service as an advocate for social justice and restoration of the rights, dignity, and humanity of the incarcerated in the United States, and for leadership in contributing to a 21st century movement for equity and social justice for all.
Thank you.
Let's just take one little photo.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Here's a box.